The desert at night is a place of whispers. When the sun falls behind the pyramids of Giza and the sky blooms into violet and indigo, the Great Sphinx emerges from shadow like a memory carved in stone. Its leonine body stretches across the plateau, weathered and ancient, gazing eternally toward the east. Tourists and scholars alike stand before it in silence, humbled by the weight of millennia pressed into limestone. But there are nights when the wind moves differently across the sand. Nights when the air carries something older than history, a question without an answer, a riddle without a key. The Sphinx has always been called singular, solitary, the lone guardian of the necropolis. Yet across centuries, in fragmented texts and fading inscriptions, another story lingers. A story of duality. A story of twins. What if the Great Sphinx was never meant to stand alone? Picture the plateau as it might have been 4,000 years ago, perhaps longer. Imagine not one colossal figure watching the horizon, but two. Mirror images carved from the living rock, flanking the sacred causeway, their stone eyes holding the balance between sunrise and sunset, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. One lion facing dawn, the other dusk. The ancient Egyptians worshipped symmetry. Their civilization was built on the axis of balance, upper and lower kingdoms united under a double crown, life reflected in death, the Nile flowing between two deserts. In their cosmology, nothing sacred stood alone. The gods came in pairs. The temples mirrored themselves across the water. Even the pharaoh's soul was split to and Ba, shadow and light. So why would the greatest monument of the Old Kingdom defy that sacred principle? Somewhere beneath the dunes, buried under centuries of sand and silence, there may be an answer. A second Sphinx, a forgotten twin, a guardian erased not by time, but by the earth itself waiting, half dreaming, for the wind to shift and reveal its face once more. This is not a story with an ending. It is a story that begins in the dark, with a question older than the stones themselves. The ancients rarely wrote in absolutes. Their records were careful, layered, woven with symbolism that modern minds struggle to untangle. But hidden in the margins of temple walls, in the fragmented papyri of Greek travelers, and in the oral traditions passed down through priestly lineages, there are clues. Small ones, easy to miss. Words that suggest the Sphinx was not always spoken of in the singular. In the pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in human history, there are references to Seshemu, the guardians, plural, stone sentinels who watched over the horizon, protectors of the solar bark as it journeyed from east to west. Translators have long debated whether these were symbolic, metaphorical lions of myth, or whether the priests were describing something real, something monumental. Herodotus, the Greek historian who wandered Egypt in the 5th century BCE, recorded what he saw and what he was told. His accounts are vivid, curious, sometimes fantastical. He wrote of colossal statues, of temples half buried in sand, of wonders that defied his understanding. And in one brief passage, easily overlooked, he mentions the lions of stone that guard the place of kings. Lions, plural. Was this poetic embellishment? A linguistic quirk of translation? Or did Herodotus see or hear of something that would later vanish beneath the ever-shifting desert? Centuries later, Roman-era travelers penned their own impressions of Giza. A merchant's journal from the 2nd century CE describes approaching the plateau from the east and seeing twin sentinels, weathered by wind and time, one still proud, the other crumbling into the earth. The text is fragmentary, a context unclear, but the word twin survives. In the medieval period, Arab scholars and geographers chronicled Egypt's ruins with meticulous care. Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, writing in the 13th century, noted that local guides spoke of a second lion that had been lost to the desert long before the pyramids were cased in white limestone. He dismissed it as folklore, perhaps too hastily. Language shifts. Meanings blur. What was once recorded as fact becomes legend, and legend fades into myth. But if even a fraction of these references point towards something real, then the question becomes unavoidable. Where did the second Sphinx go? Was it destroyed by conquest? Swallowed by sand? Or does it still rest beneath the plateau, waiting for the right eyes to find it? Meanwhile, as historians debated translation and metaphor, archaeologists began to notice something else, entirely something written, not in ink, but in stone. Mainstream Egyptology offers a clear, confident narrative. The Great Sphinx, they tell us, was carved during the reign of Pharaoh Khafor in the 4th dynasty. Around 2500 BCE, it was hewn directly from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, its massive body shaped from a natural limestone outcrop left behind by quarrying operations for the nearby pyramids. The face, weathered and enigmatic, is believed to bear the features of Khafor himself, a stone portrait of divine kingship, merging the strength of the lion with the wisdom of the pharaoh. The monument served a dual purpose, religious and political. It stood as a guardian of the royal tombs, a symbolic protector of the necropolis, and as a representation of the sun god Ra-Horakhti, the deity of the rising sun. Pilgrims would have approached it with reverence, recognizing in its form the intersection of earth and heaven, mortality and eternity. Over the millennia, the Sphinx has endured cycles of burial and rediscovery. By the time of Thutmose IV in the New Kingdom, then 1,000 years after Khafor, the monument was already buried to its shoulders in sand. Thutmose had it excavated after a dream in which the Sphinx promised him the throne if he cleared away the drifts. A granite stela, placed between its paws, commemorates this act of restoration. The Roman emperors, too, attempted to preserve it. Later, during the Islamic period, parts of the Sphinx's face were damaged, possibly by iconoclasts, possibly by natural erosion. Napoleon's soldiers found it half buried again, its leonine body obscured by centuries of desert drift. Each generation rediscovered it, each generation marveled, and each accepted it as singular. Archaeologists mapped the site thoroughly in the 19th and 20th centuries. They cataloged every chisel mark, every fracture in the stone. They measured its dimensions, 73 meters long, 20 meters high, carved in place from a single mass of bedrock. No evidence of a twin emerged. No foundation trenches, no second quarry, no companion structure symmetrically placed. The consensus was firm. There was one Sphinx, one guardian, one monument. And yet, as excavation technology advanced and surveying methods grew more precise, certain anomalies began to surface, subtle irregularities that didn't quite fit the accepted story. Features in the bedrock that suggested something more complex. Traces of human activity where none should logically exist. Centuries earlier, before modern archaeology imposed its order on the desert, the land held secrets more openly. Seen from above, the Giza Plateau reveals a geometry older than memory. Satellite imagery, captured with precision unavailable to earlier explorers, shows the land in layers topographic gradients, shadows cast by ancient depressions, faint outlines where limestone was once worked and then abandoned. The pyramids dominate the skyline, of course, their alignment near perfect. But surrounding them, the plateau is scarred with evidence of quarrying, construction, and erosion that spans thousands of years. East of the Great Sphinx, there is an irregularity. A shallow depression in the bedrock, subtle but unmistakable when viewed with the right filters. It mirrors, almost exactly, the dimensions and orientation of the Sphinx enclosure itself. At first glance, it might be dismissed as natural erosion, a pocket where softer limestone wore away faster than the surrounding stone. But erosion is chaotic. This depression is not. It is symmetrical. In the early 20th century, a British survey team noted the anomaly, but attributed it to ancient quarrying activity. Perhaps workers had begun carving out a second statue. They speculated, but abandoned the effort when the stone proved too fractured or when resources were redirected to other projects. The idea was recorded in dusty field notes and then forgotten. Decades later, a French geologist revisited the site with ground-penetrating radar. The scans revealed cavities beneath the sand voids in the bedrock, consistent with human excavation. The depth and orientation suggested something deliberate, something planned. But no follow-up excavation was authorized. The Egyptian authorities, cautious about disturbing the necropolis without definitive evidence, declined to permit deeper exploration. Still, the images remain. The radar data persists, and the question lingers. If the ancient builders carved one sphinx from the plateau, why would they leave a symmetrical foundation trench beside it? Unless, of course, they didn't leave it empty. Unless what was carved there was later removed or buried so completely that it became invisible. The plateau, after all, is not static. Over millennia, wind and flood have reshaped the desert. The Nile itself shifted course more than once in antiquity, altering the hydrology of the region. Sand dunes migrate like living things, swallowing structures whole, and then centuries later, releasing them again. Archaeologists excavating near the Sphinx enclosure in the 1980s uncovered a causeway buried beneath 7 meters of sand and debris. 7 meters, accumulated over 2,000 years. If a second Sphinx once stood exposed, how much sand would it take to hide it entirely? How many storms? How many floods? The desert does not reveal its secrets easily. But as the geology of Giza came under closer scrutiny, another pattern emerged, one that could not be explained by quarrying alone. Egypt was a civilization obsessed with balance. Every aspect of their world was understood through the lens of duality. Mat, the cosmic principle of order and truth, required equilibrium. Chaos fit was the enemy, kept at bay only through careful symmetry and ritual repetition. The pharaoh wore the double crown, uniting the red land of the desert and the black land of the fertile Nile. Temples were built with twin pylons, their gates mirrored across a central axis. Tombs contained dual chambers for the body and the soul. Even the gods existed in pairs. Osiris and Isis, Horus and Set, Shu and Tefnut, the primordial twins born from the breath of creation. And in the oldest myths, before the dynasties, before the pyramids, before recorded time, there was Aker, the double lion god who guarded the horizon. Aker was depicted in temple reliefs and funerary texts as two lions seated back to back, one facing east, the other west. Between them, the sun was born each dawn and devoured each dusk. Together, they held the boundary between the living world and the underworld, between time and eternity. The iconography is unmistakable, the symbolism profound. So why, in a culture so devoted to dualism, would the greatest guardian of the royal necropolis stand alone? Modern scholars have offered explanations. Perhaps the Sphinx was always meant to be singular, a unique monument embodying both lions in one form. Perhaps its orientation, facing due east, was sufficient to represent the dual nature of the sun's journey. Perhaps the missing twin is simply a modern projection, an attempt to impose symmetry where none was intended. But the explanations feel incomplete. Elsewhere in Egypt, the principle of duality is physical, not symbolic. At Abu Simbel, Ramses II carved two temples, one for himself, one for his queen, side by side in the cliff face. At Luxor, twin statues of the pharaoh flank the entrance. At Karnak, paired obelisks rise before the hypostyle hall. Everywhere, the sacred is doubled. Why not at Giza? Some researchers propose that the second Sphinx was never completed, that the stones cracked during carving, or the bedrock proved unsuitable, and the project was quietly abandoned. But if that were true, evidence of the failed attempt should remain chisel marks, unfinished surfaces, rubble piles. None have been conclusively found. Others suggest that the twin was completed but destroyed deliberately, dismantled by a later dynasty seeking to erase the legacy of a rival pharaoh. But dismantling a monument the size of the Sphinx would leave scars in the bedrock, a quarrying signature unlike natural erosion. Again, the evidence is ambiguous. A third possibility emerges, more troubling, that the second Sphinx was never destroyed at all, but simply buried so thoroughly that it ceased to exist in human memory. As the sands continued to shift over the centuries, explorers began to report strange, isolated discoveries that refused to fit neatly into the accepted narrative. In 1817, an Italian adventurer named Giovanni Caviglia arrived at Giza. He was not an archaeologist, few were, in that era, but a sea captain turned treasure hunter, drawn to Egypt by rumors of hidden chambers and forgotten riches beneath the sand. Caviglia spent months excavating around the Great Sphinx, clearing debris from the enclosure and tunneling into the bedrock in search of passageways that might lead to buried tombs. He found no gold, no secret chambers, but he found something else. In his journal, dated March 14, 1817, Caviglia described uncovering a fragment of carved stone resembling the paw of a great lion located approximately 50 meters east of the known Sphinx. The stone was partially exposed, jutting from the sand at an angle, weathered but unmistakably shaped. He sketched it hastily in his notes, a rough outline showing claws and the curve of a feline limb. Caviglia planned to return the following season to excavate further. He believed he had found a collapsed statue, perhaps a smaller guardian that once flanked the causeway. But when he returned a year later, the site had changed. A sandstorm had swept through the plateau, reshaping the dunes, and the stone paw was gone buried again beneath meters of fresh drift. He searched for weeks. He dug test trenches. He questioned local workers who had been with him the previous year. No one could relocate it. The desert had reclaimed what it had briefly revealed. Caviglia's notes were eventually archived in a library in Milan, where they gathered dust for over a century. When they were rediscovered in the 1920s, his account of the stone paw was dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification. Perhaps he had found a piece of broken statuary, scholars suggested, dragged to the site from elsewhere, and then lost again. Perhaps his sketch was unreliable, drawn from memory rather than direct observation. But the detail in his journal is precise. The measurements, though rough, are proportional to the Sphinx's own paws, and his description of the weathering smooth, water-worn, ancient matches the erosion patterns seen on the Great Sphinx itself. If Caviglia truly found what he claimed, then somewhere beneath the eastern dunes, a fragment of the second Sphinx may still lie waiting. A single stone paw, carved millennia ago, separated from its body by time and sand. No modern excavation has confirmed his discovery. No ground-penetrating radar has been focused on that exact location. The paw remains lost another thread in the tapestry of mystery. Meanwhile, as explorers continued to map the plateau, geologists began to notice something peculiar in the rock itself. Stone remembers. Limestone, the bedrock of Giza, is a sedimentary archive, a record of ancient seas, of pressure and time, of water and wind. It cracks in predictable patterns. It erodes along weaknesses in its grain. And when examined closely, it tells the story of everything that has shaped it. In the 1990s, a team of geologists surveyed the Sphinx enclosure with renewed focus. They were not looking for lost monuments or hidden chambers. They were studying the weathering patterns on the monument itself, trying to understand how wind, rain, and sand had worn the stone over thousands of years. What they found did not match expectations. The vertical fissures on the body of the Sphinx, they noted, showed signs of water erosion, not the shallow, wind-driven scoring typical of desert weathering, but deep, undulating channels consistent with prolonged rainfall. In Egypt's current climate, such rainfall is impossible. The region has been arid for over 4,000 years. But during the African human period, roughly 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Rivers flowed where now there is only sand. Rain fell in torrents. If the Sphinx bore signs of water erosion, the geologists reasoned it might be far older than the 4th dynasty. It might predate the pharaohs entirely. The theory was controversial. Egyptologists pushed back, citing the lack of corroborating evidence, no tools, no inscriptions, no cultural artifacts from a pre-dynastic civilization capable of such monumental construction. But the erosion patterns remained unexplained. And then, a secondary observation emerged. East of the Great Sphinx, in the depression noted by earlier surveys, the bedrock showed similar weathering. The same deep vertical channels, the same water-worn smoothness. As if whatever structure had once occupied that space had been subjected to the same ancient rains. One geologist proposed a hypothesis. If 2 sphinx had been carved during the humid period, both would have weathered identically. But if one was later buried, protected from further erosion by a thick layer of sand, while the other remained exposed, the difference in weathering would be subtle but measurable. The Eastern Depression, they argued, might not be evidence of a missing sphinx. It might be evidence of a preserved one hidden beneath the surface, shielded from wind and rain, waiting in near-perfect condition. Core samples were proposed. Excavation permits were requested. Both were denied. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority, cautious and protective, prioritized preservation over speculative exploration. Without definitive proof, no invasive survey would be allowed. So the geologists published their findings and moved on. The desert kept its secrets. But the stone, as always, remembered. As the century turned and technology advanced, the veil over the plateau began to thin, not through shovels and brushes, but through invisible waves passing beneath the sand. The Sahara is not a fixed place. It breathes, it shifts. It buries and reveals in cycles longer than human memory. 3,000 years ago, when Greek traders first reached Egypt, the pyramids were already ancient, and the Sphinx was half drowned in sand. Roman engineers cleared it. Medieval travelers found it buried again. Napoleon scholars sketched it emerging from a sea of dunes like a shipwreck from the deep. The desert does not destroy, it conceals. Archaeologists excavating in the 1920s discovered entire villages beneath the sand south of Cairo. Mud brick homes, pottery kilns, granaries still containing the desiccated remains of wheat. These were not ancient settlements. They had been abandoned only 200 years earlier, swallowed whole by a single decade of drifting dunes. If a village can vanish in 2 centuries, what can a millennium erase? The Giza Plateau itself has undergone dramatic transformations. The Nile, which once flowed much closer to the pyramids, shifted its course eastward over the millennia. Seasonal floods, which in antiquity might have reached the base of the plateau, ceased entirely when modern dams regulated the river's flow. Without the floods, the sand became more mobile, less bound by moisture, more prone to migration. Storms in the Sahara are events of almost geological violence. Walls of sand hundreds of meters high sweep across the landscape, scouring stone and burying monuments in minutes. The Great Pyramid itself has been measured after major sandstorms and found to have accumulated over a meter of fresh sand at its base overnight. Now imagine that process repeated not over decades, but over millennia. A monument standing proudly at the dawn of the Old Kingdom could, by the Middle Kingdom, be nothing but a vague mound beneath the dunes. And by the time of the New Kingdom, when Thutmose IV dreamed his prophetic dream, even the memory of its existence could have faded into myth. There is precedent for this kind of loss. In the 19th century, French explorers excavated the Temple of Abu Simbel and found it buried to the tops of its colossal statue 60 feet of sand accumulated over 3,000 years. Only the crowns of the pharaohs' heads were visible above the surface. local Bedouins had no knowledge of what lay beneath. It was simply another dune among thousands. If Abu Simbel could vanish, why not a second Sphinx? The question becomes not whether it could have been buried, but whether anyone would have remembered long enough to record its disappearance. And if they did, whether those records survived the collapse of dynasties, the burning of libraries, and the endless cycles of conquest and ruin that swept through Egypt over 3,000 years. By the time the desert finally began to yield its secrets to modern science, the line between history and legend had blurred beyond recognition. But some stories, it seemed, refused to die. Deep in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, far south of Giza, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected. Scratched into the walls of a foreman's hut, drawn in red ochre on a fragment of limestone, were crude diagrams maps, essentially showing the layout of the Giza Plateau. These were not the precise architectural plans of royal scribes. They were working sketches, rough guides for laborers who needed to know where to quarry stone, where to haul blocks, where to deliver water and bread. Most of the sketches depicted the pyramids, the causeways, the boat pits. But one fragment, catalogued in the Cairo Museum under an obscure reference number, showed something else. Two figures, side by side, rectangular enclosures surrounding them. Annotations in hieratic script, faded and incomplete. The translation is uncertain, but the words Sishimu and West are clear. Guardians, West. The map suggests a pair. For decades, scholars assumed the diagram referred to statues that no longer exist, perhaps smaller monuments flanking a temple entrance, long since dismantled and reused in later construction. But when the dimensions sketched on the limestone were compared to the actual measurements of the Sphinx enclosure, the correlation was startling. The two figures on the map were not small. They were colossal. Another clue emerged from quarry records. Stonemasons in ancient Egypt kept meticulous logs of where they extracted limestone, how much they removed, and where it was sent. These records were usually carved into the quarry walls themselves, graffiti, essentially, but graffiti with a purpose. Near the Sphinx enclosure, a quarry wall bore an inscription noting that stone had been taken for the second lion. Second. The phrase was easy to overlook. Translators initially assumed it referred to a second phase of construction additional stone for the existing Sphinx, perhaps for repairs or enlargement. But the grammar does not support that reading. The inscription clearly denotes two separate entities. Elsewhere, fragments of workers. A stroke of broken pottery shards used for informal writing mentioned deliveries of bread and beer to teams working at the Twin Guardians. Again, the word twin appears. Individually, these references are ambiguous. Collectively, they form a pattern. The workers who built the Sphinx knew of another. They wrote about it casually, without fanfare, as if its existence were unremarkable. It was simply part of the landscape, another task, another monument, another day's labor under the sun. But when those workers died, and their children's children forgot, the monuments remained. Or one of them did. The other slipped from history into the realm of echoes. As modern technology began to peer beneath the surface of the plateau, those echoes grew louder. In 2015, a multinational team of researchers brought ground-penetrating radar to the Sphinx enclosure. Their goal was not to search for a second Sphinx officially, at least, but to map subterranean voids that might indicate hidden chambers or passageways beneath the monument. Legends of secret rooms, popularized by 20th century mystics and treasure hunters, had persisted for decades. The team aimed to settle the question once and for all. They deployed their equipment in a grid pattern, scanning methodically across the bedrock. The radar waves penetrated deep into the limestone, bouncing back patterns that revealed density variations, cavities, and fractures invisible to the naked eye. Most of the scans showed solid rock. A few indicated natural fissures, expected in limestone. But east of the Sphinx, In the depression noted by earlier surveys, the radar returned something unusual. A void, not a small cavity or a collapsed tunnel, but a large, regular anomaly, roughly the size and shape of the Sphinx enclosure itself. The data suggested empty space, or at least space filled with something less dense than the surrounding bedrock. Sand, perhaps, or rubble, or air. The depth was approximately 40 feet below the surface. The team ran the scans again, adjusting frequencies, verifying calibration. The anomaly persisted. Its boundaries were distinct, its geometry deliberate. Whatever lay beneath was not a random geological feature. It had been shaped. The findings were published in a peer-reviewed journal, framed carefully in the language of scientific caution. The authors noted that further investigation would be required to determine the nature of the void. They speculated that it might be a collapsed chamber related to Old Kingdom construction, or perhaps a quarry pit that had later been filled in. But they did not rule out the possibility of a buried monument. The Egyptian authorities reviewed the data and once again declined to authorize excavation. The risk of destabilizing the existing Sphinx, they argued, was too great. Any invasive exploration beneath the enclosure could trigger subsidence or structural damage. The monument had stood for 4,500 years. They would not jeopardize it for the sake of speculation, and so the void remains unmapped, the anomaly unconfirmed, the silence beneath Giza unbroken. But for those who study the plateau, the radar images linger, a shadow beneath the sand, a shape that should not be there, a possibility that refuses to disappear. Elsewhere, in the margins of history and myth, older stories began to resurface stories that had once been dismissed as fantasy. In 1933, an American psychic named Edgar Cayce made a prediction. He claimed that beneath the Great Sphinx, in a hidden chamber known as the Hall of Records, lay the accumulated knowledge of a lost civilization, Atlantis. He said, or a predecessor to Egypt, destroyed by cataclysm 10,000 years ago. The hall contained scrolls, artifacts, and technologies far beyond the ancient world. It would be discovered, Cayce prophesied, before the end of the 20th century. The prediction was widely mocked by archaeologists. No evidence of such a chamber existed. No ancient texts mentioned it. And Atlantis, of course, was myth, a parable invented by Plato, not a historical reality. Yet decades later, when ground-penetrating radar revealed cavities beneath the Sphinx, Cayce's followers took note. In the 1990s, a team of independent researchers petitioned the Egyptian government for permission to drill exploratory boreholes beneath the monument. They cited Cayce's prophecy openly, framing their request in terms of alternative archaeology and ancient wisdom. Petition was denied. Mainstream Egyptologists dismissed the entire affair as pseudoscience. The cavities detected by radar, they argued, were natural fissures or old excavation tunnels, not hidden chambers filled with lost knowledge. But the controversy had an unintended consequence. It brought renewed attention to the anomalies beneath Giza. Academic researchers, distancing themselves from Cayce's mysticism, nevertheless began to ask more rigorous questions about what the radar had actually found. In 2002, a robotic camera was inserted into a narrow shaft leading from the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. It discovered a sealed door. Beyond the door, more passageways. The pyramid, it seemed, held spaces that had never been entered in 4 millennia. If the Great Pyramid concealed hidden chambers, why not the Sphinx? The Hall of Records, as Cayce described it, almost certainly does not exist. But the idea that something lies beneath the monument, something unmapped, unexplored, has proven harder to dismiss. Cavities exist. Radar confirms them. Whether they contain treasure, tombs, or simply empty stone, no one yet knows. And so, the silence holds. Meanwhile, in the iconography of ancient Egypt, a recurring symbol offered another clue. In the tomb of Seti I, on the walls of the Valley of the Kings, A scene unfolds. Two lions, identical in form, sit facing opposite directions. Between them, the solar disk rises Ra, reborn from the underworld, crossing the threshold of dawn. The lions are Aker, the double guardian of the horizon, the keeper of gates between night and day, between death and resurrection. Aker is one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, predating even the pyramids. In the earliest depictions, carved into pre-dynastic pottery and amulets, Aker appears not as two separate lions, but as a single creature with two heads, one looking east, one west. Later, the iconography shifts, the heads separate. The lions become distinct, but the symbolism remains. Duality, balance, the eternal cycle. The connection to the Sphinx is impossible to ignore. The Great Sphinx faces east toward the rising sun. Its leonine body and human head merge animal strength with divine intellect, a fusion of earthly power and celestial wisdom. It is, in every sense, a guardian of the horizon. But if the Sphinx is Aker, where is its twin? Some scholars argue that the twin is symbolic, not literal. The second lion exists in myth, in the journey of the soul through the afterlife, not in stone. The Sphinx, they suggest, embodies both lions in one form, a unified representation of duality. Others point to temple reliefs at Karnak and Luxor, where paired sphinx flank the entrances. These are smaller, human-headed lions carved in the New Kingdom, long after the Great Sphinx. But they demonstrate that the concept of twin sphinx was not foreign to Egyptian architects. Why, then, would the greatest of all sphinx stand alone? An alternative interpretation emerges from the mythological texts. In the Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased must pass between two lions to reach the field of reeds, the paradise of the afterlife. The lions judge, test, and guard. They are gatekeepers, threshold spirits. And thresholds, by definition, require two pillars. If the Giza Plateau was understood as a threshold, a liminal space between the living world and the eternal, then two sphinxes would not merely be decorative. They would be functionally necessary. One to open the gate, the other to close it. One to welcome the rising sun, the other to bid farewell to the setting. The theology is elegant, the symbolism profound. But theology alone does not build monuments. If a second sphinx was intended, if it was carved and placed, then where did it go? Astronomical theories began to offer another layer of meaning. The ancient Egyptians did not see the sky as we do. For them, the heavens were not distant or abstract. They were intimate, immediate, woven into the fabric of daily life. The stars were gods walking across the firmament. The constellations, sacred maps. And the alignment of monuments to celestial events was not symbolic, it was essential. The pyramids of Giza are aligned with astonishing precision to true north. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point toward specific stars, Sirius, Orion's belt stars, associated with Osiris and rebirth. The Sphinx itself faces due east, positioned to greet the sun at the spring equinox. But some researchers have proposed a deeper alignment. In the constellation of Leo, visible in the night sky during the spring equinox around 10,500 BCE, there is a striking similarity to the shape of the Sphinx. The body of the lion, the angle of the head, the posture all mirror the celestial figure with uncanny accuracy. This has led to speculation that the Sphinx was not merely a monument to a pharaoh, but a terrestrial marker for a specific moment in astronomical time. If that alignment was intentional, then another question arises. Was Leo the only constellation encoded in the plateau? At the opposite horizon, during the same epoch, the constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, rose in the west at dusk. Some researchers have suggested that a second Sphinx facing west might have aligned with Aquarius, creating a cosmic symmetry. One guardian for the lion, one for the water-bearer, one for dawn, one for dusk. The theory is controversial. Mainstream Egyptologists point out that the zodiac as we know it was not formalized until the Greco-Roman period, long after the Sphinx was carved. The Egyptians recognized constellations, yes, but their astronomical traditions were different from ours. Still, the alignment persists in the geometry. And geometry, unlike translation, does not lie. If two Sphinx once marked the horizon, one for Leo, one for Aquarius, then the plateau would have functioned as a monumental celestial clock, measuring the precession of the equinoxes across thousands of years. It would have been a map of time itself, written in stone. Whether such a vision guided the builders remains unknown. But the stars, like the stones, remember. Across Egypt, the principle of mirrored monuments appeared again and again, a recurring architectural signature. Stand before the twin colossi of Memnon, and the symmetry is overwhelming. Two massive statues, each depicting Pharaoh Amenhotep III, sit in perfect parallel at the entrance to his mortuary temple. They are identical in dimension, in posture, in expression. One on the left, one on the right. Mirrors carved in stone. Travel south to Abu Simbel, and the pattern repeats. Ramses II, ever the megalomaniac, carved two temples into the cliff face, one for himself, one for his queen Nefertari. Four colossal statues of Ramses flank the main entrance, seated in pairs. Inside, the sanctuary holds twin altars, twin offering tables, twin depictions of the gods. At Karnak, twin obelisks rise before the temple of Amun-Ra. At Luxor, paired statues of the pharaoh guard the pylon. At Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut's mortuary temple features twin colonnades, twin ramps, twin sanctuaries. Duality is not incidental in Egyptian architecture. It is foundational. The ancient builders understood balance as more than aesthetic. It was cosmic law. Maat demanded it. The gods required it. To build a monument without its counterpart was to court chaos, to invite Isfet, to disrupt the equilibrium that held the universe in place. So why, in this context, would the greatest guardian of the necropolis, the monument that preceded even the pyramids in symbolic importance, stand alone? The archaeological record offers no clear answer, but the pattern is undeniable. Wherever Egypt's builders raised something monumental, they raised it twice. One possibility is that the second Sphinx was completed and stood for centuries, perhaps millennia, before some catastrophe, political, geological, or climatic, led to its ruin. Another is that it was never finished, that some unforeseen obstacle halted construction, and the project was quietly abandoned. But a third possibility haunts the edges of the evidence, that the second Sphinx was not destroyed or abandoned, but deliberately buried hidden for reasons. Lost to time, preserved beneath the sand, as a kind of insurance, a reserve monument for a future age. Such practices were not unknown in Egypt. Statues were ritually killed and buried to contain their power. Tombs were sealed and forgotten to protect them from looters. Entire temples were covered with sand by priests, seeking to preserve sacred knowledge from invaders. If the second Sphinx was buried intentionally, it would explain the absence of destruction debris. It would explain the anomalies in the bedrock. It would even explain the silence in later records. If the burial was secret, known only to a few, then the monument would have vanished from history without a trace. The desert, after all, is the perfect vault. As explorers searched for physical evidence, other discoveries hinted at mysteries deeper still. In 1902, archaeologists excavating near the ancient port of Alexandria uncovered a waterlogged papyrus scroll. The text was fragmentary, written in Greek, dating to the early Roman period, roughly the 1st century CE. Most of the document dealt with mundane administrative matters: grain shipments, tax records, complaints about harbor tariffs. But one passage, almost lost in the damage and decay, described a pilgrimage. The author, whose name is illegible, recounted traveling up the Nile to see the wonders of the Old Kingdom. He mentioned the pyramids, the Avenue of Sphinx at Karnak, the colossal statues at Thebes. And then, in a line that has puzzled scholars ever since, he wrote, "At the river's mouth, two mighty lions of stone guard the threshold. Weathered by wind and water, their faces turned toward the endless sea. At the river's mouth." The Nile, in antiquity, had multiple branches, 7 major distributaries that fanned out across the delta before reaching the Mediterranean. The westernmost branch, known as the Canopic, flowed near Giza before curving north toward the coast. In the Roman period, the river's course was different from today. Closer to the plateau were the two mighty lions, a reference to the Sphinx and a now-lost twin? Or were they monuments located elsewhere, near the delta, perhaps at the coastal city of Canopus or Alexandria itself? The text provides no further detail. The papyrus breaks off. The pilgrimage ends mid-sentence. Scholars have debated the passage for over a century. Some argue that the author was describing metaphorical lion statues at a temple gate, symbolic guardians rather than colossal monuments. Others suggest he conflated memories from different sites, merging the Giza Sphinx with other statues he had seen along the journey. But a few researchers have proposed a more literal reading, that the Roman traveler saw 2 sphinxes at Giza, one still standing, the other partially visible beneath the sand-eroded, crumbling, but unmistakable. If so, it would be the last recorded sighting. No later texts mention a second sphinx. No medieval travelers report seeing one. By the time Napoleon arrived in 1798, only the Great Sphinx remained alone, enigmatic, half buried in the desert. The Roman papyrus, if accurate, marks a vanishing point. A moment in history when the twin still existed, or at least was visible enough to be remembered. After that, silence. Elsewhere, in the deep past before dynasties, the land itself held clues. 10,000 years ago, Egypt did not exist. There were no pharaohs, no pyramids, no temples. The Nile was younger, wilder, carving new channels through the landscape with every flood. And the desert was not a desert at all. It was savanna. Acacia trees dotted the plains. Grasses grew waist-high, swaying in the wind. Rivers and lakes speckled the land, fed by monsoon rains that swept up from the south. Elephants wandered the valleys. Giraffes grazed along the riverbanks. And lions, real lions, not carved in stone, roamed freely across the green expanse. This was the African humid period, a climatic epoch that lasted from roughly 12,000 to 5,000 years ago. The Sahara, today the largest hot desert on Earth, was fertile, habitable, alive. Human populations flourished here, leaving behind rock art, pottery, and tools that speak of a sophisticated, settled culture. And then the rain stopped. The shift was gradual at first, a few dry decades, then a century, then longer. The grasslands withered. The rivers shrank. The animals migrated south, following the retreating moisture. The humans adapted, moving closer to the Nile, which alone continued to flow, fed by distant mountains in the heart of Africa. By the time the first pharaohs unified Egypt around 3100 BCE, the desert had fully reclaimed the plateau. The green world was gone, erased by heat and wind. Only the Nile remained, a slender thread of life through an ocean of sand, but memory lingers. In Egyptian mythology, the earliest times were remembered as a paradise, the first time, or Zep Tepi, when gods walked the earth and the land was whole. Later, priests spoke of it in fragments, in allegories, in half-forgotten hymns. The lion, in particular, held a place of reverence. It was the animal of the sun god, the protector of the horizon, the symbol of strength uncorrupted by time. What if the Sphinx, both Sphinx, were carved during that earlier age? The hypothesis is radical. It suggests that the monuments predate dynastic Egypt by millennia, that they were created by a culture we know almost nothing about, during a time when the climate allowed for monumental construction, and the Giza Plateau was not a desolate quarry, but a living, accessible site. Geologists point to the water erosion. Archaeologists cite the absence of cultural artifacts. Egyptologists argue that no civilization capable of such engineering existed before the Old Kingdom. But the stones themselves remain silent on the question. They do not date themselves. They do not explain who carved them or why. And if they were carved earlier during the Green Millennia, then the second Sphinx might have been lost, not to the pharaoh's amnesia, but to the slow, inexorable march of climate buried, not by conquest or neglect, but by the desert itself reclaiming the land. The question of age leads inevitably to the question of builders. Inside the Great Pyramid, in the King's Chamber, the granite blocks fit together with extraordinary precision. The joints are so tight that a razor blade cannot slip between them. The surfaces are polished smooth, not with abrasives alone, but with techniques that remain mysterious. And the core drill marks, circular grooves, cut into solid granite show a depth and uniformity that modern engineers struggle to replicate with steel tools, let alone copper chisels. Copper, after all, is soft. Softer than limestone, far softer than granite. The tools recovered from Old Kingdom tombs, bronze saws, wooden mallets, stone hammers, could certainly shape limestone with patience. But granite? Granite requires hardened steel, diamond-tipped drills, or techniques lost to time. Some researchers propose that the Egyptians used an abrasive slurry sand and water mixed with copper to grind through stone. Experiments have shown this method can work, slowly, laboriously. But the precision of the cuts, the speed implied by the scale of construction, suggests something more efficient. What that technique might have been, no one knows. The same mystery surrounds the Sphinx. The body is carved from relatively soft limestone, yes, but the head, the face, shows tooling marks that imply controlled, fine detail work that should require metal chisels sharper and harder than anything the Fourth Dynasty is known to have possessed. Were the builders more advanced than we credit them? Did they possess knowledge that later generations lost? Or were the monuments carved by someone else entirely a predecessor civilization, a culture that flourished before the dynasties and then vanished, leaving only their greatest works behind? The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The tooling is anomalous, but not impossible. The engineering is impressive, but not beyond the reach of determined human effort. And yet, the questions persist. If the Egyptians inherited the Sphinx rather than built it, then the mystery of the twin deepens. Was the second Sphinx still standing when the pyramids were raised? Did it collapse, or was it already buried? And if it was buried, did the ancient Egyptians know it was there? Perhaps they did. Perhaps they chose to leave it hidden, believing it sacred, untouchable, meant for another age. Or perhaps they simply forgot. As the centuries passed and the desert reclaimed the land, other parts of Egypt's past slipped beneath the waves literally. Off the coast of Alexandria, beneath the Mediterranean, lie the ruins of ancient worlds, Cleopatra's Palace, the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders. Entire districts of the Ptolemaic city, drowned by earthquakes and rising seas over 2 millennia. Divers exploring the harbor have found statues, columns, sphinxes, plural toppled and scattered across the seabed like pieces of a shattered dream. The Mediterranean, in antiquity, was lower than it is today. Coastlines that are now submerged were once bustling ports. Temples that are now underwater stood on dry land. And the Nile itself had a different delta wider, with more branches, extending farther into what is now open sea. Could remnants of the second Sphinx lie beneath the waves? Some researchers have speculated that as the Nile shifted course and the coastline changed, monuments near the delta were lost to flooding. If the second Sphinx stood closer to the river than its twin perhaps, on lower ground, more vulnerable to seasonal inundation, it might have been gradually undermined, toppled, and eventually submerged as the water table rose. No evidence supports this directly, but the precedent is there. In 1996, underwater archaeologists discovered a colossal statue of a sphinx near the submerged ruins of the palace complex. It was smaller than the Great Sphinx, yes, only a few meters long, but the style was ancient, pre-Ptolemaic, possibly Old Kingdom. Its presence raised questions. How many sphinx did Egypt carve? How many were lost to time, to war, to the sea? If one could vanish beneath the Mediterranean, could another rest beneath the sand at Giza, awaiting the patient work of excavation? The sea and the desert are not so different. Both are fluid. Both bury and reveal. Both keep their secrets until the moment is right. Meanwhile, the limestone of the plateau, the bedrock itself, held its own silent testimony. Limestone is fossil. The blocks of the pyramids, the body of the Sphinx, the bedrock of Giza all were once the floors of ancient seas. 60 million years ago, the region lay beneath a shallow tropical ocean. Shells, corals, and the calcium-rich skeletons of marine creatures accumulated in layers, compressed over eons into solid stone. When you touch the Sphinx, you are touching deep time. You are brushing your hand across the remains of life that existed before continents took their present shapes, before mammals walked upright, before anything resembling humanity dreamed itself into being. The rock remembers. Geologists studying the plateau have identified microfossils in the limestone tiny shells, calcified algae, fragments of ancient ecosystems preserved in the stone. These fossils tell a story of climate, of ocean chemistry, of life and death across millions of years. But they also tell a more immediate story. The weathering of the Sphinx, the erosion patterns, the fractures and fissures. All are written into the stone like pages of a book. Wind-driven sand scours horizontally. Rain carves vertically. Freeze-thaw cycles create spalling and flaking. Each type of weathering leaves a signature, a fingerprint that can be read by those who know how to look. And the signatures on the Sphinx do not all match. Some sections show intense water erosion. Others, sheltered beneath later repairs, show almost no weathering at all. The body bears scars from rainfall that should not have occurred in historical times. The head, by contrast, is comparatively pristine, suggesting either that it was recarved during a drier period or that it was added later to a body already ancient. The stone itself becomes evidence, a witness to events that no human recorded. If a second Sphinx lies beneath the sand, its stone will tell a similar story. The weathering, the fossils, the layers of sediment that cover it all will speak, once uncovered. But until then, the archive remains closed, the record hidden. As myth and history began to intertwine, the line between allegory and fact grew ever more difficult to trace. There is a story the priests told, long after the pyramids were built, long after the Old Kingdom fell and new dynasties rose. The temple scribes at Heliopolis recorded their sacred traditions. Among them was the tale of Ra's journey through the underworld, the Amduat, the book of that which is in the afterlife. In this text, Ra's solar bark passes through 12 hours of night, each guarded by gods, demons, and monstrous gatekeepers. At the threshold of the 6th hour, 2 lions appear. They sit facing opposite directions, one toward the past, one toward the future. Between them, Ra is reborn, emerging from darkness into light. The lions are not named, but their function is clear. They are the boundary, the gate, the moment of transformation. Centuries later, this myth became fused with the iconography of the Sphinx. Pilgrims visiting Giza saw in the monument not just a guardian of tombs, but a symbol of cosmic passage, the lion at the horizon, marking the transition from night to day, from death to life. And if one lion marked the gate, where was the other? The question may have troubled later priests. The symmetry of the myth demanded 2 lions, but only one Sphinx stood visible on the plateau, so the story adapted. The second lion became metaphorical, a creature of the afterlife rather than stone, present in spirit if not in form. Myth absorbed history. Allegory replaced fact. And the memory of the twin sphinx, if it ever existed, faded into the realm of symbols. This is how cultures forget. Not through sudden erasure, but through slow transformation. A monument becomes a story becomes a legend becomes a metaphor, and one day, no one remembers that it was ever real. But the desert does not forget as easily as humans do. And sometimes, when the wind shifts, the sand reveals what was never truly lost, only hidden, waiting for the right moment to return. The sun sets behind the pyramids, casting long shadows across the plateau. The Great Sphinx sits in stillness, as it has for millennia, its leonine body scarred by time, its face worn smooth by wind and rain and the passage of countless ages. Tourists gather at its paws, cameras raised, voices hushed in the presence of something that feels older than language. But there are no crowds tonight. The site is closed. The desert is empty. And in the silence, it is possible to imagine another sphinx, just out of sight, just beneath the sand. A twin guardian, buried so deeply that even its memory has become myth. Perhaps it lies 40 feet down, encased in limestone dust, its form intact, waiting for the archaeologists of a future century to uncover it. Perhaps it was destroyed millennia ago, its stones carted away to build a pharaoh's palace or a priest's tomb. Or perhaps it was never there at all. Perhaps the second sphinx exists only in the spaces between evidence and interpretation, in the gaps where history falls silent and imagination fills the void. Perhaps the ancients spoke of two lions, not because they built two, but because the symbolism demanded it, because duality was sacred, because balance was divine, because the cosmos could not be expressed in singular form. But there is something haunting in the anomalies, the radar scans, the erosion patterns, the fragmentary texts, the sketch of a stone paw, the Ramang papyrus, the workers' graffiti, the satellite depressions. Each piece alone proves nothing. Together, they whisper a possibility. The desert does not surrender its secrets easily. It demands patience, humility, and time. It buries what it wishes to hide and reveals only what it chooses. And Giza, for all the excavations, for all the surveys and studies and centuries of exploration, remains a place of mysteries unresolved. Perhaps one day, a team of archaeologists will return to the Eastern Depression with permission to dig. They will clear the sand, layer by layer, and find what? A second enclosure. A carved body. A twin sphinx weathered by ancient rains, its face still bearing the features of a forgotten king. Or perhaps they will find nothing, just bedrock, just stone. And the mystery will persist, as it has persisted, because some questions are more valuable unanswered. Some riddles are meant to endure. The wind sweeps across the plateau, carrying with it the dust of ages. The stars emerge, cold and distant, the same stars that watched when the pyramids were young, when the Sphinx was new, when the desert was green, and lions walked freely beneath an open sky. Somewhere beneath the sand, a truth waits. Whether it is the truth of a buried monument or the truth of human longing, our need to believe that the past holds secrets grander than history admits may not matter. Both are real, both have power, and both, in the end, are carved into the stone.